On July 8, 1996, 4 German tourists consisting of 2 adults and 2 children arrived in Seattle, Washington, before traveling on to Los Angeles, California, and then further to Las Vegas, Nevada. From there, they would rent a 1996 Plymouth Voyager minivan to visit the sites in the Southwest American desert. One of these sites was Death Valley National Park, the site of the hottest air temperature ever recorded. The week of their visit, temperatures hovered around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or 49 degrees Celsius. They filled in a journal for tourists at a mining camp attraction on July 23rd, saying that they were going to explore a pass in the park. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. They did not board their scheduled flight back to Germany on July 27th, and the Voyager minivan they had been renting was reported stolen in September. It took 3 months of diligent search and rescue operations involving dozens of personnel to find even a trace of where the German tourists had gone. A number of clues were found, but what little was discovered had eerie implications. On October 21st, 1996, 3 months since the tourists had last been seen, the minivan was located in Anvil Spring Canyon, an area rarely used even by experienced hikers, hidden by rolling desert hills and accessible only by 4-wheel drive vehicles. The area in which the van was found was 4 miles from where they had filled in the mining camp journal. The missing Voyager had not been stolen, as the rental company and police had naturally assumed when it was not returned on time. Rather, the van was found well off the beaten path, with all but one of its tires completely flattened. Of the flattened tires, one had fallen completely off the rim, probably from the inhospitable and rocky terrain that it had driven over. When it came to a stop, the rented van was mired in sand up to its axles. It appeared that the van had been driven about 200 feet from where its tires had been damaged, before being unable to go any further. No human remains were found in or near the vehicle, but almost 2 miles from where the van was located, a beer bottle was discovered under a bush, and a small scuff mark was found on a rock in a small patch of shade under the bush, where one of the adults must have stopped to rest. While the tourists were in their stranded vehicle, the group must have exhausted their water supply, as several large jugs of water were left completely empty inside the vehicle. It's unknown how long they stayed in the van before deciding to strike out on foot to remedy their hopeless situation. This meant that the only source of hydration they had, in temperatures as high as 124 degrees Fahrenheit, were 2 unopened bottles of beer, and likely the empty bottle that was found in the bush. Even in the middle of the night, the temperatures would have stayed in the low to mid-90s Fahrenheit, offering little respite from the heat. The search was called off 5 days after the van was discovered, and all with no sign of the German tourists resurfacing. There's a lot of long, agonizing, and drawn-out ways to die of heat stroke, the horror of which would only have been magnified while touring a foreign, unfamiliar country with 2 extremely young children dependent on you, and having to lead them through the most barren and hostile landscape of an unfamiliar land. as all of their bodies quickly approached the physical point of no return. In November 2009, 13 years after the tourists went missing, 2 skeletons were found by off-duty search and rescue personnel 8 miles from the abandoned van. DNA testing and personal effects revealed that these were the 2 adult tourists. It is thought that they were attempting to reach the U.S. military base at China Lake in hopes of finding help, but collapsed from thirst and exhaustion only a few miles from the base perimeter, which was not regularly patrolled even if they had managed to reach it. The remains of the 2 children were not with the remains of the adults, and they have not been found since. However, since children succumb to high temperatures faster than adults, it is possible, if not likely, that they died earlier in the trek through the desert hills, and their remains were left behind by the 2 surviving adults, before they too succumbed to the extreme conditions of Death Valley. The group may also have gotten separated in their heat-induced delirium without the others noticing. But whatever circumstances may have surrounded their deaths, and in what order, these 4 tourists have since become known as the Death Valley Germans, and they are far from the only people to die or go missing in the park. In February 1995, a suspected murder scene was discovered in the yard of a single-family home in the Australian city of Canberra. An unnamed 39-year-old man was found dead within 150 meters of his home, with several gunshot entry wounds to his upper body. To say that the man had been killed was an understatement. Internally, he had been obliterated. The internal injuries the man had suffered were consistent with projectiles fired at close range from a shotgun, which several members of his family had heard earlier that night, but either did not notice or ignored, because they were either asleep or otherwise preoccupied, and so did not investigate. Having left the house at 10 p.m., when the man hadn't returned home by 5:30 a.m. the next morning, his wife remembered the gunshots from the previous night and took it upon herself to search the surrounding area. At first, she found nothing, but eventually, her husband was found at the bottom of a slope near their house, having been dead for hours. The weapon was sitting on top of the slope, as though whoever had shot him had fled, leaving the shotgun behind. The initial murder hypothesis didn't explain why an incriminating murder weapon was left behind, relatively close to the deceased, and why no traces of another person or foul play were found on or around the property. Upon further investigation, it became clear that these wounds were self-inflicted. The family members of the deceased recalled that he had come home from work in a seemingly normal mood, socialized with his family, ate dinner, watched television, and waited until his family went to bed. Afterward, he had retrieved a bag of shell cartridges, loaded 4 shells into a 12-gauge shotgun, and went deep into the backyard, before firing the contents of 1 shell into his chest. This shot was not fatal, as most of the pellets fired from this shell bounced off of his ribcage. After this, the man walked from his backyard to his car, where he prepared to fire again. The second shell shattered his jawbone, tore out most of the flesh in his throat, and even some of his teeth. However, despite such physical trauma, he remained alive. To the absolute horror of medical investigators, when the man recovered the strength to stand once more, he walked 136 meters from the location of the second shot. Breathing through a hole the shotgun blast had torn in his throat. For the second time, he ejected the spent shell from his firearm and fired a third, fatal shot through his chest cavity, and this time the shot had the desired effect. Clearly, this individual was very intent on ending his life, for reasons that nobody could discern, but the position in which his body was found was perplexing, and indicates that even the third fatal shot did not immediately result in his death. Whether through instinct or regret, the shotgun had been dropped some distance from his body, and where he had finally collapsed from shock and blood loss, his hands were found clutching at his throat, as though desperately trying to stem the bleeding, to stop the life from gushing out. However, it was all in vain, as only a few shavings of the man's heart were left after the third and final shot ripped through his midsection. One of the most powerful natural phenomena on Earth, tornadoes can inflict harm on the communities they impact in innumerable ways. One such way came to light in the final days of May 2011, when over 160 people lost their lives and over 1,100 others were injured after an extremely violent EF5 tornado tore through Joplin, Missouri, early in the evening of May 22nd. Many people who were not injured were still caught in the wreckage or came to their homes or workplaces to find virtually nothing left. The process of recovery after such a wondrous disaster would be daunting enough, but as residents of the city discovered, to their horror, the carnage did not end when the funnel disappeared back into the clouds. As the first disaster was wrapping up, the seeds of a new disaster were already in the works, and it provided a bone-chilling implication of what could happen in future natural disasters, especially tornadoes. Neither the most experienced healthcare workers or the most seasoned residents of Tornado Alley could have imagined what was about to unfold. 6 days after the tornado, a seriously injured victim sought medical attention because the skin around their wounds was starting to blacken like gangrene. The infection was not purely local either. It would continue to spread once it appeared, taking over more and more of the visible skin, which became necrotic and started to die. This patient's experience was also not an isolated event. In the next few weeks, over a dozen people came forward with similar flesh-eating infections. This kind of sickness was totally unprecedented, and the overworked medical staff were at a loss as to what was causing them or how to respond. In the meantime, other survivors of the tornado were terrified that the same thing could soon happen to them or their families, given the sheer number of wounded and the fact that the twister had destroyed many of the city's medical centers and clinics. It wasn't long before things got worse. A few days after the victim's skin would become gangrenous, a white, fuzzy mold would break through the rotted skin, indicating that the spores were already spreading inside the bodies of the injured. The appearance of the resulting wounds was unspeakable. Within 2 weeks of the tornado, 13 people had presented these symptoms, of whom 5 eventually died. What the victims had in common was how they had come to receive their injuries. The damage was not uniform along the tornado's path, but rather the center of the path was an area of total or near total destruction, typical of a violent twister, and all of the victims suffering from the mysterious illness had been located in this region, receiving an average of 5 or more wounds from flying debris or collapsing structures. Somewhere along its path, the Joplin tornado had sucked up soil in which the fungus Apophis trapeziformis was dwelling, which ended up on pieces of debris or became airborne, and which was blown by the wind deeply into the wounds of the tornado's victims. What distinguishes Apophis from similar fungal infections is the ability of the parasite to evade the immune system of even healthy individuals, resulting in catastrophic infections like those that occurred in Joplin. In a brutal case of life over limb, the only solution that medical personnel could think of was to excavate and cut away the skin ahead of where the infection had already spread, before it spread any further or deeper into the bodies, and many had to undergo more than one of these procedures. In fact, the average victim of the Joplin tornado's fungal infections had to endure over 5 such surgeries, and even still, several deaths resulted. In a few cases, the surgeons discovered that the rampant fungal spores had colonized beyond the flesh and into the bones of their victims, resulting in the removal of some of the victims' skeletons. One patient even lost their entire rib cage, which was replaced with a titanium substitute. The majority of the 13 people affected would survive, but 5 of them would lose their lives within a few days or weeks of becoming infected by the Joplin tornado fungus. Even then, the survivors would be left with horrible recollections of the tornado, their resulting illness, and the long journey to recovering from the physical and mental trauma of both.